All right, here we are at the Your Coach podcast, and I'm John LaFranco, and I'm with my good friend and colleague and athlete and great person, Annyck Besso. Hi, how are you?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Very excited to have you. So we've had in the in this podcast to try to bring in people that are in my circle. I've had a couple coaches. I recently had my massage therapist. Um, and now Annyck, whose special set of skills falls on the nutrition and diet side. So um, maybe you can start, Annyck, by telling us what you do as a professional, and then we can sort
Yeah.
of go from there, talking about running after that.
Yeah. So I'm a registered dietitian. I specialize particularly in treating people who have eating disorders, and I also work with athletes. So I see a lot of athletes who also have eating disorders or disordered eating, or also athletes who are just looking to work on fueling or increasing their performance through nutrition strategies.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And I've definitely benefited from your expertise, not only personally, but also athletes that I've coached. And the feedback is always very positive. Not just you, but also your team. So you have a company. You want to talk about that and your team?
Yeah, so I do have a private practice. It's called Suma. So we have physical locations in the Montreal area, and we also offer virtual consults throughout Canada and the United States. So yeah, we're a team of about, I think, 12 dietitians now.
Mm.
So yeah, we're a bunch, and a lot of us do specialize in sports nutrition as well, and are athletes. And then we also treat eating disorders.
Nice. So okay, so kind of go back to the beginning. Like, how did you get into running?
Yeah. So running was it was a funny, I guess, introduction. Initially, I started running because a boy that I liked was on the cross country team, and it was just a way that I could run with him. And it was very humbling because he was not running very fast at all for him, and I was very much running fast and suffering to try to keep up and chit chat. And then, I always really enjoyed running. I think that it was fairly easy for me. And in high school, it kind of became disorder for me as well. Like it was a way that I could control my body weight, lose weight. So I had to take a step back from running for a little bit just to heal. And then when I started university, I just started running more recreationally. And then I realized that if I had more specific targeted training and worked with a coach like you, then I could really improve. So I joined McGill Olympic, which was your former team at the time in 2014. And then started really getting into like half marathon and marathon distances. And one of my big goals, I think, before having kids was to try to run a sub 3 hour marathon, which I did
Yeah.
with a lot of difficulty, just made it. And then, yeah, I think now I love to run too. I recently just ran a half marathon, but I think it's different just with kids and,
Yeah.
lack of time. But running for me has always been a way that I could take time for myself, and also just honor my body and respect it, but also see that when you put in hard work and you're dedicated, that you can also get results. And then there's the whole nutrition piece, obviously, for me that
Mhm.
I got into sports nutrition for personal reasons, but then as I trained with women and men and people that were trying for these like really fast times, but always bonking, I was like,
Mhm.
oh, there's something here.
Yeah. Um, so do you think that you will return to training where, kind of having these specific time goals, try to run under 3 hours again or something, or a different sort of performance type goal? Or you mentioned, you have kids now, so maybe that's just, not where you're headed and running is serving a different purpose. What's the future of
Yeah,
running for you?
I think it's tough because my kids right now are almost a year old and 2.5. So right now I could not imagine putting in enough mileage to run a sub 3 hour marathon. But I think I have time goals that are a bit more conservative right now. So, I like having goals. I like working towards specific times. But I think the marathon, for me, just running a marathon to run it, I feel like I know that I could do that.
Mm.
So I'm like, I don't really want to put that stress on my body if it's not to try to perform in some way. And I don't think I could give it the proper attention right now. But maybe when my kids are 10 and 9,
Yeah.
they'll want to spend less time with me. I'll have more time to train.
Yeah, for sure. No, but that's great. I think it's a question and answer that kind of speaks to a post that I've written that should be up like next week, just about motivation and different reasons people run, and that, I think sometimes, especially when you have been, competitive like you were, it can feel a little bit like a letdown to, like, like, because people always want to get the next thing. So like, okay, sub 3 hour marathon. So then maybe like, 250 or something like that. But if it's not realistic in your, in your daily life, then it's not a good thing to try to push through that. But probably there are a lot of people who don't kind of make the connection between, like, their life changes and their performance and training. So it's good that, I think goals are goals, right? Like if you have different time goals, or just, I think recently, like, just, to, run this half marathon, like, to, train enough to, have it get done, that was a big goal, and it worked, so it's good.
Yeah, and I like it was hard for me at the end. I mean, you saw me.
Yeah.
I was working hard, and I think that's what feels really good. I think to your point too, I've always been really realistic in terms of my capacity because I think I try to do things really well. And
Mhm.
having the business, having a team,
Mhm.
it's a lot of work, a lot of energy, and it's something that feels really fulfilling. But I remember like years ago, you had said you can be good at 3 things and
Mhm.
like you just have to choose wisely. And I
Mhm.
think sometimes people, as their lives progress, you like try to hold on to maybe past versions of you. And
Mhm.
then you just end up really like frustrated because you're not necessarily doing well in any area.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I don't know, I'm kind of going through this. I'm just having like these sort of on and off injury things, and the general consensus feedback tends to be that, like, it's just because I'm old now. And it's a bit glib, and I try to, like, you're only as young as you feel, kind of thing. But at the same time, realistically, yeah, my body is not the body that I once had, and so I have to adjust my expectations and things like that. And so I bought a treadmill,
Oh,
so that,
that's big for you.
not so
Yeah.
much for now, but for winter, um, because I like to run, like I want to run, but
Yeah.
anyway. So, um, okay, so you mentioned a bit you got into nutrition for personal reasons. Can you expand on
Mhm.
that? Like, what's this? Because obviously that's one of your three things,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
nutrition. It's and you're a professional at it. So how did you get there?
Yeah, so I think I briefly mentioned that I had struggled with an eating disorder in high school, and thankfully, I had a really good treatment team, and I do consider myself fully recovered, but it really dictated kind of my career path. So I went into nutrition knowing and kind of having this vision actually of like Thuma, like
Hmm.
a private practice that, would treat eating disorders because I think at the time, this was years ago, but at the time there wasn't really that many services available. And I think in Canada, with the public health system, you have to be pretty sick to get services that way. So I did my bachelor's and then a master's and kind of had this vision that after I got some experience with eating disorders that I would open the practice. And along the way then with running and fueling and also seeing that there was this intersection of eating disorders in sport. And I think the sport culture, a lot of the times, like I was very fortunate in my work with you, and even I think just the culture of our team, there was
Mhm.
never any of
Yeah.
that. But as you know, there's just a lot of pressure, I think, in running, a lot of focus on body weight and it being linked to performance. And I think it's really easy to underfuel in endurance type sports. So that kind of was something that I didn't necessarily set my eye on as I like started nutrition, but over time I was like, oh, these two things that I now specialize in
Mhm.
can very much overlap and really speak to me personally.
Yeah, so I have a couple questions based on what you just said. One thing was, you have this vision of Suma. So did you envision it being, kind of this team with a number of people? Like why? Because it's sort of like it's like an extra thing. Like it's not just nutrition and being a dietitian, it's running a business, which is a whole other thing that you have to do. So why do
Yeah.
that instead of just, kind of say, okay, it's me, Annick, and I'm here to help you and that's it, and not have all that hassle of all these other things.
Yeah, so I think for a few reasons. I think one, for eating disorders, like the multidisciplinary approach is super important. So as part of my vision, it's like we'd be a team of dietitians, psychologists, maybe one day have psychiatrists and um, doctors might be a reach, but maybe doctors too. Just because I think when we see people with eating disorders, you really need a lot of those people involved.
Mhm.
Um, I also do think I have this little like business sense in me. So the idea of managing people felt like a something that spoke to me because I'd been in different workplace environments and saw stuff that I thought worked well and other things that didn't work well. And I wanted to offer this place where people could be kind of reunited with this kind of joint vision to provide client-centered care, evidence-based care, and that I could be this leader in a way that maybe like a quiet leader that like not so much like do what I say, but like do what I do. And so it's offered me this really beautiful challenge in a lot of ways. I think, being a boss is kind of like being a mom. It's very humbling,
Yeah.
and there isn't a proper book that will teach you how to deal with humans. So I really like that aspect of the clinic too.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I think I mean, it certainly to me it fits with your, your personality and stuff. And I think, it's also important, especially in the area of eating disorders, but just generally professionally, like your own limits and your own level of expertise, and there are always going to be other people that can bring something else. Like perfect example is, as a coach, coaches, especially running coaches, are often asked to play a whole bunch of different roles. And the truth is we're not set up for that. Like I'm not a dietitian or even a nutritionist. Like I what I know I probably just know from you, and obviously I can help someone, like if they're training for a marathon, and I can say, okay, like during the race, like this is what you should do, and during the taper, like for the carb loading, this is what you should do, and we should practice it during long runs. But after that, like that's not my area, so I need to bring in someone whose area it is, and that's you obviously, but or your team. And so I think for your team too, like there's, you have a certain set of experiences, but then you've got, your people like Elsa and Vero and all that. Like
Yeah.
they have their experience too. So I think yeah, it's really good. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do also with this like podcast is like kind of, show all the different areas that are kind of behind supporting athletes in running. And so kind of
Yeah.
on that note, you talked about the culture of running and how it can sometimes lead to this. So yeah, I kind of want to ask you like the how do you think runners can help balance that? Like because people want to, in training, like optimize everything. And so
Hmm.
optimization often kind of has a connotation of like, streamlining or like
Yeah.
being efficient or less. But then the truth is the energy demands of running endurance or endurance training generally, are they require you to do more. And then there's that kind of conflict. And then there's the intersection of the type of people that tend to be endurance runners. So how do you kind of when you're talking to a client or something, like kind of pull out like what are the root causes of any kind of potential disorder, because it could come from many different places. Like it could come from just a misunderstanding of what
Hmm.
is required, or something kind of deeper that they're, a psychological thing, or it could just come from, or sometimes coaches can say the wrong thing and have people kind of off in the wrong direction because of like a kind of a offhand comment that they didn't mean anything, but it sent someone thinking something. So
Yeah.
how do you work through that with people?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, because a lot of times people are like, oh my gosh, did I cause this eating disorder? In parents. And what we know from the evidence is that it's not possible to cause an eating disorder. Like you said, it's a bunch of factors together where people have biological vulnerabilities, and then there are situational factors that might trigger those. I think running in general, and these are all huge generalizations, but runners and athletes are over controlled in a lot of ways. Like we love, and I can totally relate to this, the plan and what is right versus what is wrong. And I think running as a sport is so you can get so much data and like the input and the output. So I think, like you said, the temperament in general of like runners, endurance athletes are these like high performing, fairly like rigid individuals, which are temperaments that are perfect for eating disorders. And then I think what happens is that while you're seeing that you can run better by doing the trainings and following the plan, then it's like, okay, so how do I optimize more? And typically, I think the information that is found, in the general public is very much misunderstood. And so people typically tend to cut instead of add in. And usually I would say that a lot of the problems that we see with athletes are misinformation, underfueling. And I think, like you said, there's kind of this spectrum where I've seen athletes that are, underweight, they're chronically injured, and you chat with them and they're like, I just didn't know. And so you talk with them and you're like, hey, let's add in X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, okay, great. And they're on their way. There's no issue with that. And then, maybe on the further end of the spectrum where we can say it's more of an eating disorder, the issue becomes more complex because then, the fear of your changing body or the very, very rigid beliefs around food and performance, you can see that it's not as simple as like, hey, here's the education, let's add in the food, but there's more of this like psychological, emotional complexity to it. And in that case, it's just, I think, harder to treat. But what I love about athletes is that at the end of the day, they love their sport, that they want to perform well in their sport. And oftentimes in recovery, if you can keep the sport present in some way, obviously, like with medical clearance and all of that, then that really becomes the why to do these really hard things so that you can then run. And what's cool about running is usually, you weight restore a bit, you feel better, you actually perform much better very quickly. So the results are pretty quick to change.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great answer. I think, because it's, kind of I guess, a medical diagnosis, we tend to focus on that one extreme, but um, like, can you give some examples of the other extreme and just sort of ways? I don't want to ask you for numbers or things like that, because obviously that can be misinterpreted and it's very individual, but like, I think we've talked about this and I don't know if there's a number, but like, I think most distance runners are probably under fueling based
Yes.
based on the training they're doing, and so that's not to say like it's not most distance runners have an eating disorder. That's not what it is. It's just you're just not getting enough fuel, and so you're kind of always tired, and
Yeah.
and you think, oh well, I'm training a lot, so I should feel tired, and yeah, you kind of should a little bit, but there's probably ways to fix that. So what are some what's some advice for runners to just sort of make sure that they know that they're getting what they need to get?
Yeah, I think, well, one, if you are following any like general advice of like your Apple Watch or MyFitnessPal or kind of like energy requirements online, you're most likely under fueling. Um, I think in general, it would be to not cut anything out unless you have obviously like a medical condition, you have to be gluten free or whatever. But in general, I think what I say for runners is like, yes, absolutely. Nutrition does play a role in like the recovery and like fueling your body. And you want to think about like carbohydrate and protein and all of that. And typically, even if you do all of those things, you probably still don't have enough energy. So then let's add the cookies, the ice cream, the donuts, because really those things, even though people perceive them as like empty calories and non-nutritious, what they're doing there is adding one, the pleasurable component of eating food, and two, it's actually allowing you to really go meet those energy needs for recovery. So the protein, the carbohydrate, all these like in air quotes healthy foods are doing what they need to do in your body to help repair, recover, perform. And then all of these other foods that society tends to perceive as more empty, they're actually just helping you keep your energy availability up. But I think a few examples, if people are like, I wonder if I underfueled, like, okay, a perfect example is, I used to do long runs every weekend. I like would run doubles like fairly consistently and I ran full time, right? So I would have to sleep like, 8 to 10 hours a night. And that was really important. But I would never come home from my long run and have to like lay on the couch all day. Yeah, I was
Oh,
tired, but like I would like still kind of like live my life. So
sure.
if you're coming home from a training and you are completely like knocked out for a few days, it's
Yeah,
like
that's
there's probably something with your fueling there because
right.
if you're able to do your workout, like it
Mhm.
means that your body can like
Right.
respond. But if you're not appropriately fueling, it just
Right.
means that your body's like completely dead
All right.
afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take a little pause here for a sec, and then we'll come right back. Okay, we're back. Brief pause there, but yeah. So you're talking about the long run and how sometimes people will you can get through it, but then like you're just like shot for the rest of the day, or maybe even a couple days, and that can be a sign that maybe you're under fueling.
Yeah, exactly. And I think to give kind of like another example is that people sometimes are putting in a lot of mileage. They're doing in air quotes like everything they need to be doing, yet they have these like nagging injuries, or they kind of like show up to their races and they don't perform based on like what they think they should be doing based on their workouts, or they're having a really hard time progressing. So it's like I'm making all these changes in terms of my training strategies, yet I'm like still not really progressing. Usually that's also an underfueling thing because when you think about it, like training is a stress on the body. And you want to stress the body so that then it can respond and get stronger, right? And get more fit. But in order for it to respond and get more fit, it then needs to like rest and recover.
Yeah.
And I find what's so interesting about runners in general is that we put so much emphasis on the training. And we're like, I
Mhm.
did my mileage, I did my minutes, I did my
Mhm.
workout. And then
Yeah.
it's like, okay, are you sleeping? Are you hydrating? Are
Right.
you eating? Like, what's your stress level? And it's like, oh,
Right.
I didn't think about any of that.
For sure. I mean, what I like to tell people sometimes is like you're training, max 1, 2 hours out of the day, and then you've got another 22, 23 hours there. So, hopefully at least 8 of those are sleeping, and and you're spending a good chunk of those eating. Obviously, people have to work and do things, like we're not talking about professional athletes here, but there's
Yeah.
still a lot of things people can do to to recover better. But you're right, it's not where the mind goes, when you think of like how to improve, like what's the next thing I can do. It's like, oh, let's do double thresholds, or let's do like more hills
Yeah.
or whatever. But like, yeah, you can do that, but then you need to also make sure that you can recover, and the feeling is a huge part of that. So that's a good example.
Yeah. And I think another thing I would add is, we're in this like realm of intuitive eating and like eat when your body's hungry and stop when you're full and all of that.
Mhm.
And, I don't know how much, well, who knows what type of athletes are listening to this and like if they subscribe to that. But I find that eating when you're an athlete cannot be intuitive typically. It kind of has to be like your training that like, sometimes if I wake up in the morning, I had a bad night of sleep. It's like, do I want to go for a run? Like, absolutely not. I would prefer to sleep the extra hour. And like, does it feel important to me? And is it like what's going to allow me to reach my goal? Like, absolutely. So then I go and I feel much better. So
Or
I
even just
find
having a better
sometimes,
day after a bad night's sleep, like, going for a
yeah.
run will energize you. You probably need to make sure you go to bed early later, but it will help you.
Exactly. It really does help once you're out. It's kind of like getting out the door. And I think that eating sometimes is kind of like that it's like, oh, I'm not hungry. Like I don't feel like eating. But it's like once you start eating, you're like, whoa, I actually like feel so much better and more energized. So sometimes I find working with a dietitian just to kind of like determine, oh, how much do I need to eat and what does that look like could be really helpful.
So this is a good segue to kind of the next set of questions I wanted to talk about, which is because I'm sure people will want to know, like, what are your thoughts on various different fad diets? So I have a couple like things, but you probably know more about what the fads are. Like, what about fasting? Like, this is the thing. Well, people think it's healthy to fast, and maybe like in different sequences or whatever. Like, what's the
Yeah. Yeah. So there has been research, obviously, that fasting, there's different types of fasting. So like you can like fast for a day and then eat for a day. For example, you could like fast for several days and then kind of like eat freely. But I think the biggest one is like the time restricted feeding. So you kind of like fast for let's say like 18 hours and then you have a window of like eating for 6 hours. So the research around that is really that it can help with a lot of metabolic conditions. So like markers of like cardiovascular health, diabetes, all those things tend to decrease. What I think is, people might hate this answer, but I'm like super anti fad diets, I think in life, but like specifically for the athlete
right?
population, because I'm like, okay, if we think about athletes in general, like low energy availability is typically a huge, huge concern. So then you're going to close your window of time to eat to be 6 hours in the day. And then what does that look like just in terms of your training and even being able to like properly do quality workouts, like if you're fasting most of the day. So the intermittent fasting is actually like the evidence, it's not even my personal opinion, is like it's not recommended for athletes in general. Um, I think another one that's I think more popular with athletes than the intermittent fasting, just based on my work, is the low carb diets. Those, big sigh, because there is some research that it can help, if depending on how much protein you're taking in. So, you want to preserve lean body mass typically in any sport because you want power and strength. And so usually a big problem too with athletes is that because you're under fueling, you're actually like breaking down lean body mass. So if you're someone who's focused on the scale, you might be like, oh, I'm losing weight, I'm lighter, but you actually might be losing muscle mass. So the research with the low carb diets, I think just to like make it very brief, is that like there is evidence that it can help kind of build lean body mass and decrease fat mass. But typically in like strength athletes or people that don't need to I guess perform at high intensity. So what's been difficult is that in terms of like aerobic capacity, you could actually sustain kind of a certain effort just by burning fat. But what happens is that it can actually really impact like the quality and like your capacity to like push, I guess. Like I'm gonna say push or like kind of push harder in
Yeah,
running.
like you can run. I mean, we try to train this in marathon running a bit is the ability to use fat as a fuel. But the
Yeah.
training that we do is to try to make you use that fat as a fuel at a faster pace, at a pace that is the performance pace that you want. Because yeah, if you go for a very slow jog, like more complicated than this, obviously, but like that's kind of like the fat burning zone,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
And
Yeah.
and so that's fine. So you could go and do that, but you wouldn't be running your marathon at your marathon pace then. So the
Yeah.
part of the long training is to kind of to increase the speed at which you can burn fat. Um,
Exactly.
but what I think about this too is that like okay, like it, I see the attraction in trying to use that method to get yourself in a certain state, but but you lose all the benefits of training that you're doing at that time because you're not, like we said before, you're not recovering well because you don't have the carbs, right? Like,
Yeah.
isn't that
Yeah.
that's kind of the thing. Like you can't have both because you may fix your muscle mass or whatever, that kind of thing with protein like you said, but you won't be able to put in the work
Replenish. Yeah,
and
exactly.
because you're not replenished. So yeah, it's a It's a tough one. People
And I
always
think
want to
with
get
the
into
low
it.
carb too, like if you're somebody who's like training at a pretty high level and like you're followed, let's say by like the coach, the dietitian, like everyone's kind of like working together. It's
Mhm.
that, you know, you and I could like chat and be like, okay, so this person's going to do like X training run one
Mhm.
night. Then what we're going to do is like a low carb dinner that
Mhm.
night after the workout. And then we're going to do like a threshold workout the next day just to
Mhm.
see what does that look like and train the body to be able
Mhm.
to more efficiently use the fat as fuel because they're fasted. But
Yeah.
like then the person gets back and they're eating like a super high carb breakfast
Right.
for the recovery because that's been so much stress on the body. And I think what feels important, it's not to be like, oh, this person's running is more important versus this one, but it's like
Mhm.
there are all these strategies that in the research, it's like, how do we optimize performance?
Mhm.
But like even somebody like me who's trying to run a sub 2 hour marathon, I'm like, I don't really need to do that. Like I
No.
just need to like increase my mileage, sleep properly, fuel appropriately,
Yeah.
and like usually it's gonna like work out for me.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think that people always look for these sort of like the hacks and the like the one, the percent, the marginal gains. But if you're not doing, if you're not maxing out like the basics, then those things don't have as much of an impact as they would on, someone who's like already, hitting, 10 out of 10 on every other training intervention. It's like altitude training. Like people want to go to altitude, but like, well, but how much are you running at sea level? Because if you can run more at sea level, then you'll have the same, not the same, but you'll improve your, aerobic abilities that way without spending the money and time to go to
Yeah.
altitude. Or the double thresholds. Like people want to jump into double thresholds. Like, well, are you even doing, single
Yeah.
thresholds properly? Like, let's start where you're at, right? And so that can apply to nutrition as well, which is just eat enough and eat well. Are there any other fad diets, kind of hot right now that we should talk about to keep people away from them?
Trying to think. Um, yeah, I'm like not super in the world of fat diets. I kind of live in a bubble in that sense, but
Hmm.
I'm like, well, one thing, it's not a fad diet. It's just like the thing right now. Like I see so many runners that are like, oh, but my protein and like my protein, like everyone is obsessed with protein.
Hmm.
And I'm kind of like, protein is very important.
Yeah.
And carbs are more important. And I
Right.
find carbs are just like, that kid on the playground that got a bad rap somehow and everyone's like avoiding them. But
Yeah.
I'm like, they're really cool and they're really helpful.
Yeah.
So I think it's not so much a fad. I just find that people really um they undervalue carbohydrates and like there's so much literature about the importance of carbohydrates in recovery, in hormone balance, in injury prevention, in performance. And so I think the big fad of like too much protein, like no runner, I see runners that are like, yeah, like I'm taking in like 2.5 to like 3 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. And I'm like,
Mhm.
what? Like that is just it's just unnecessary and it's very filling. And
Mm.
so you're really taking away from being able to take in more carbohydrates.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So again, an example of I think people looking for, that sort of marginal solution when really, what they need is the macro solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what do you think makes people gravitate towards this and not just sort of like, like they say like, what your nona would make for you kind of thing, or like, like that
Yeah.
sort of idea. Like why is, and maybe that's wrong. I don't know if that's like a proper sort of diet advice is eat what your grandmother would say, but like, you know what I mean? Like why do people gravitate towards these things? What is it about food that makes people like go nuts?
Oh, that's a big question. But I think, food is complicated.
Mhm.
I think all of our relationships with food and our body is really
Mhm.
complicated. And if I had to, like, again, generalize, but I think fad diets are very similar to, running prescriptions and like doing what's right. And, our obsession with all this data now with like the watches and stuff is that if we have a structure and data that tells us like this is right versus this is wrong, it's very reassuring because then we don't have to kind of like figure it out and risk doing it wrong. And honestly, I've never been like that with like food, probably just because of my training, but I can really relate to that when I was a new mother. Like I was like, I'm doing what they say in the books, and like I'm doing all the things, and like he's not sleeping and he's crying. And it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and I remember my mom being like, but he's a human. Like you're
Yeah.
not gonna find the book that's gonna
Yeah. No one's
like
written the book
meet.
on him yet.
Yeah, but I'm like, okay, but then how do I know if it's right or not? And
Mhm.
you don't, you have to kind of like develop that instinct, I guess. But that felt terrifying to me. And so I can really relate to runners that want to do well. And you're putting in so many hours trying
Mhm.
to train that you're like, well, I want to do everything I can to kind of optimize this. And so when you read stuff online, it's so hot in a way. Like
Mhm.
they make nutrition advice sound so simple in books
Mhm.
and online that you're
Mhm.
like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Of course, this is going to help me run
Yeah.
better. But when I talk with people,
Yeah.
it's very complicated to like determine how we like meet your needs and what's kind of getting in the way and what does your job look like and what's your relationship at home like and what do your kids eat and
Mhm.
what's
Yeah.
your food budget and
Yeah.
all of that. So
Hot
there's a
dogs.
lot
My
to
kids had hot
consider.
dogs last night. I'm not afraid to
Yeah.
admit they had hot dogs because it was because my wife and I were going to go out, so we had our own dinner. So we were like, hot dogs,
Yeah, exactly. See,
and that's
hot dogs
okay.
is the
They're
thing.
fine,
Yes.
you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Like your children will die if they eat hot dogs. But I think that too, there's so much like value like put on, oh, what type of like how do you feed your kid? And do you give your kid juice? Do you drink juice? And like, juice can be really great for athletes and for children in terms of like a quick fuel.
Mhm.
So I think that's where people want just the guidepost to feel safe and secure that they're doing it right.
Mhm.
Um, and unfortunately, nutrition's just not like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about this one because I seem to, I don't know why, but I seem to encounter more and more athletes who have some kind of gluten intolerance
Mm,
or all the way to celiac. Like, so I guess my first question is, am I seeing this right? Like, does it seem like there's more of this? And if so,
yeah.
why? And I mean, maybe you're not the one to resolve that that big issue,
Yeah.
but like, and then what can people with a gluten intolerance or celiac kind of do to get in the carbs they need if they're runners? Because there's a lot of carbs that are also kind of, gluten. So,
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right to be seeing that. I think we've been seeing that a lot more too at the clinic, like GI stuff.
mhm,
I don't think there is research, but not like tons yet. But my whole suspicion is that a lot of our GI stuff is also related to mental health and stress. So it's all connected, right? And
mhm,
so, and again, not I don't want to invalidate people that truly have GI stuff.
mhm,
It's something to consider, but we see a lot of people that are cutting out gluten and have gluten sensitivities and truly report that like they have like decreased anxiety, they feel much better. And so I think there are some people that the way gluten reacts in their GI tract is more inflammatory. And
mhm,
so when there's inflammation in the body, there is more stress, more anxiety. So I I find GI as a dietitian, somebody that comes to me with GI stuff, it really feels like a crapshoot, for lack of a better word, because
mhm,
it's a lot of trial and error, unless you're like diagnosed celiac, right? Like that's a medical test. And so it's like, okay, great. Like
mhm,
this is very
mhm.
clear cut. Other people, what becomes hard is that they have reactions, and then you have more anxiety about the reactions. And
Yeah.
sometimes then you start limiting food a lot more because you're
Mhm,
worried about just feeling so bad. Um, but I guess to answer the question about the carbs, we think about carbs as mostly being grains, but there's carbs in fruits, like carbs are sugar, right? So I think there's a lot more gluten-free products, but when we think about rice, that's gluten-free. When we think about oats, there's like gluten-free flour. So I think as somebody who tried being gluten-free for a bit because we thought my son was allergic to gluten, I think it can be more complicated, but there are a lot more foods that are really interesting, like, chickpea pastas or like even quinoa pasta, like stuff like that, that if you have the food available in your kitchen, it's like a lot easier to like go towards it. I think you just have to be a bit more intentional about having that food available and like planning out what you're bringing with you, because sometimes just like stopping somewhere and picking something up can be a bit harder. Um, I also think there's a lot of, I'm going to say in air quotes, like processed gluten-free stuff that people are like, oh, it's healthier because it's gluten-free. And so I think that could be a fad too, that it's like, it's not because it's gluten-free that it's necessarily healthier. Like a gluten-free granola bar is still a granola bar, and the one that's not gluten-free could be just as good.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense for sure. I think it's yeah, and the connection between the gut and the mind. Like I don't think that you need to, to worry that it's like minimizing. I think that it's linked. Like it is the same thing. Like because just because something is potentially, caused by anxiety doesn't make it not real. Like the stomach is
Yeah.
still, hurting. Um yeah, okay. So I mean, we've kind of danced around it a bit, but is there a best diet? What is the right diet? Can we
Yeah.
can we talk about that?
Yeah. I'm like, okay, how do I say the best diet? I think the best diet, one, like at baseline, the best diet allows you to fuel appropriately. So
Hmm.
like you could be doing, I don't know, the whey protein supplements and the creatine and the beet juice and all of that. But like if you're under fueling, it's not going to change anything
Hmm.
in your body, because underfueling creates an inflammatory state in the body, and so it's
Hmm.
very difficult to then recover. If I had to choose like a diet,
Hmm.
all the research for years and years, decades,
Yeah.
Mediterranean diet.
Hmm. So
So
what
the
is that? What's the
Mediterranean diet,
Mediterranean diet?
yeah. So basically, if you kind of Google Mediterranean diet pyramid, I really like that too, because it's a pyramid. So it's like, here, have all of these foods, like however much you want. And then it's not like eliminating foods, it's just like limit the foods. So, at the bottom of the pyramid, you see a lot of like whole grains, omega-3 fatty acids. So fish, olive oil, avocado, what we call like these like healthy fats, nuts, seeds, and then kind of as you move through the pyramid, it's like then you have dairy, then you have meat, and then at the top of the pyramid, you kind of have like what we would deem as like processed foods. So like, kind of like cakes, candies, donuts, and all of that stuff. And I really like, I don't necessarily like use this diet in my work, but for me, I'm kind of like, obviously it's really difficult with like our busy lifestyles, but like if you can go as close as possible to the food source, um, typically that'll be the most wholesome and nourishing food for you. So, like making oatmeal, or kind of like, I don't know, making like a dinner with like chickpeas and rice and veggies. So if you can have a diet that, I'll say, limits red meat consumption to some extent, but red meat then for athletes and iron, all of that, and is as homemade as possible. So kind of like the nanas diet, like I think that's true. And then increasing these like omega-3 fatty acids, it's like one that increases the energy density of your day, but two, they're also anti-inflammatory. So they kind of like help the repair process
Hmm.
in the body. And then fruits and vegetables, obviously. The thing with fruits and vegetables is that I think a lot of athletes like love fruits and vegetables. It's just that they're pretty like voluminous. So they kind of fill you up without providing like too many calories. So if somebody's like, oh, I had an apple for a snack, it's like, okay, we'll have an apple and then try to have, I don't know, like a bowl of full fat yogurt with like some nuts or some granola or something. So that way it's like you're still getting more calories even though you're still having your apple.
And so this is sort of the first time that you've mentioned various dairy products. That's sort of another avenue where there are people that are kind of lactose intolerant. I'm lactose intolerant.
Yeah.
I mean, so, and it's funny because it's not like not medically diagnosed exactly, but it's very clear. And interestingly, like my dad was as well. Like my dad never ever had dairy, and I remember asking about it one time. He's like, "Well, I just don't like the way it makes me feel." And
Yeah.
he was not a man to like to be like diagnosing things or going to the doctor or anything like that. So he just, was like, "Yeah, no, this doesn't make me feel good. I'm not going to eat it. That's it." So
Yeah.
what are some alternatives to that, that, for people that dairy kind of, upsets their stomach?
I think, if we think about like high fat kind of like protein alternatives, like I think nuts are great, nut butter. I think, depending, because some people are kind of like icky about soy, but like there are
Mhm.
a lot of different like soy yogurts. Trying to think what else. I mean, you can cook with like almond milk or soy milk. What's tough about something like almond milk is that it's not very high in protein.
Mhm. Yeah, it's mostly
And it's
water.
not very like energy dense. So
Mhm.
it's just that when you're going to protein sources, you wouldn't actually consider, I think, the dairy-free sources as a protein source. But in general, like there are a lot of dairy alternatives that are typically made with soy that are pretty high in protein, and can be pretty good. And I think after that, legumes,
Mhm.
depending if people aren't necessarily like eating meat and fish. If you're somebody who eats fish, I'm a big fan recently of like canned fish because I think sometimes you can just like bring canned fish with you somewhere if you're in a rush. And you can like put it on a piece of whole grain toast, like
Mhm.
have it with, some vegetables on the side, and it's pretty filling and nourishing without having to like cook yourself a piece of like tuna or
Mhm.
salmon.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. Cool. So, I mean, we sort of touched on this as well as sort of like the last big question. I'm trying to ask everybody this about what, what they do. Like, how do you help people run fast? So you've got a client and they come in and they say like, okay, I want to, do better here. Like, what's your process with a runner?
Mm,
The questions you ask, and how do you kind of point them in the right direction? Obviously, it's going to be case specific, but
yeah.
yeah.
So a big thing, usually if a runner comes to see me, like we talk about their goals, like where are they right now in their training? And then I kind of like look again at like what does their diet look like? What intolerances do they have? What barriers do they have?
Mhm.
I think well, I don't think, but we recently collaborated on a runner that,
Mhm.
for him, he doesn't have any like preoccupation with his body weight and shape. He just wants to like run as fast as he can
Mhm.
and do it. Like he has two children at home. He has like a pretty like high level job. And so what came out is like there just really was like a lack of nutrition knowledge, and the timing of the fueling was actually like not optimal. And so what's been really interesting is that because there were like these big gaps where he wasn't necessarily eating, and then there was like some digestive stuff, it's like kind of educating and then um, implementing. So with the education, it's that yes, there's a structure that's kind of offered to the runner, but they kind of know they're not tied to the meal plan per se. They kind of understand like how was this thought out, and so then how can I vary it?
Mhm.
And then, when we meet again, it's kind of like, okay, so how did you respond to this and whatever? And then how are we going to kind of optimize the fueling? So if you're eating appropriately, you're recovering, everything's good, then we talk about, okay, so then how do we start like optimizing fueling strategies during training? What's your hydration like? Then, okay, maybe we can talk about supplements. So it's kind of, I think of this pyramid where it's like, is somebody fueling adequately? Then what are the macronutrients that they're taking in? Then what is like the timing of the fueling? And then how can we like supplement them to try to maximize this as much as possible? But like this is something that happens over time. So yeah, it's not necessarily that we're going to put supplements in right away per se.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. It's a good plan. I think that skill that you're kind of hopefully teaching people of ability to modify the plan is huge because I think that runners, you know, tend to be a bit stressed about that. Like I'll often say, okay, here's the plan for the week, and then I'll get like a frantic email like, oh my God, like can I move my off day from Friday to Thursday? I was like, yeah, like it's fine, like I mean, there's certain things obviously that are in order, and like you want to have, hard, easy, and stuff like that. But like it's I think it's good in a way that people like are think that the plan is like as detailed as it is for a reason, and that you wouldn't want to put anything out of place. But I think it's also good to be able to understand like the general principles and be like, yeah, this is going to be okay if I run like 45 minutes this day instead of an hour, and then an hour this day instead of 45. Like
Mhm.
that's fine. And so it's sort of, I think with nutrition, it's kind of like the same thing. Like it's not that like you must eat like 15 grams of almonds at 12 o'clock. It's that after your run in the middle of the day, you need to have a little bit of protein, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing that maybe is different from me that does also allow people to run faster. And we've talked about this, but like I think the collaboration for me is super important. So, you and I often collaborate and it's like, what does this plan look like? What's the effort? Like, how do we make changes? Sometimes I work with athletic trainers, massage therapists, physios too, just so that this runner can really feel like, okay, all these people are communicating and now I feel empowered and I understand like what's happening in my body and how I respond to that in all these different areas instead of feeling like each person is kind of siloed and they're imposing this plan on me that I don't necessarily understand and don't know how to adapt.
Mhm. Yeah, that collaboration is really important for sure because, I think, like I said, like in the training plan, like things are there for a reason and are arranged, accordingly. But then if there's, if they're working with you, then obviously nutrition is a priority. We want to make sure that that's working so we can move things around in order to,
Mhm.
simplify that kind of thing. Like if someone has to like if they have to get up super early to do their run and they don't have a lot of time to eat in the morning, then maybe we can move things around so that the intensity isn't that super early run, because that might be harder to do if like if you're not as fueled or something. So anyway, just an example.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay, well, those are all my questions. Thank you so much for coming on. I think that hopefully people found this to be valuable. I think we went through a lot of things that are pretty common questions for people. It's a big, big issue. Like people are always asking about, what do I do for nutrition? What do I do for nutrition? And now
Mm.
when I say talk to Annyck, they can now have a reference to who you are and what you're all about. So I really appreciate that. Is there anything else you want to add kind of before we go here?
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, we could talk about this for
Yeah.
hours, but it was really nice to touch on those topics. And thank you so much for having me.
No, great. Well, thanks, and we'll see you around real soon.